Welcome to the Turkish History Podcast. Episode 40. On a Mule's Back. Before we begin, if you have been enjoying this podcast, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get this podcast. It would mean a lot to me and would help more people find the podcast. Thank you for listening. So last time, we discussed the origins of the beyliks of Anatolia and the Sultanate of Rum. We ended with Sulayman as the master of İznik and northwestern Anatolia, recognized by the emperor of the Romans as an independent power, as the Sultan of Rum. And today, we are going to discuss Sulayman's audacious attempt to build a sultanate and consolidate his power over the nascent beyliks of Anatolia. But we will also see his own audacity undo him. As with so many leaders in history, his greatest attributes ultimately became his greatest curses. Now to begin, we need to discuss the sources we have and some of the problems with them. As I said in our earlier episodes, the Muslim histories are of course deeply biased in favor of the beys and in particular Sulayman and the Sultans of Rum. Basically, they want to present these states as both legitimate and powerful. As we saw, this means essentially lying and saying that they were founded on the express orders and with the blessing of the great Seljuk court. It also means presenting the leaders as ghazis, prosecutors of jihad, when in reality, their states were basically founded through cooperation with local Christian elites. And now that we're getting to the actual establishment of the Sultanate of Rum, its expansion from a small principality centered around İznik into a great power ruling large swaths of Anatolia, this bias means presenting the Sultanate as far more centralized and dominant than it really was in its early days. Basically, the Islamic sources make it seem like both the rise of the Sultanate of Rum was inevitable and that it basically came out of the oven fully baked. That is, from the beginning, that it was a centralized state that was the unquestioned master of Western Anatolia and the foremost of all the beyliks. And the Byzantine sources really aren't any better. As I said in the earlier episodes, it's kind of shocking how little attention the Byzantine historians pay to the details of the most important thing happening to their empire. They are so mired in the details of what was happening in Constantinople and the Balkans that they basically don't write at all about how they lost what used to be the heartland of their empire. The only historian who writes with any detail at all is Anna Komnena, the daughter of Emperor Alexios. Her masterpiece, the Alexiad, is in essence a history and a biography of her father, and it seeks to exalt him and defend and justify his reign. But this, of course, presents its own problems. First of all, Komnena always paints the Turks as a basically invincible force. She does this because she has to explain why her father was incapable of driving them out of Anatolia while still being the greatest emperor of all time. If the Turks are all-powerful, then you kind of can't blame her father for not rescuing Anatolia, because such a thing was not possible. Instead, you can celebrate him for doing a great job with the bad hand that he was dealt. So she routinely exaggerates both the extent of Turkish power and also the power of the Turkish beys, in particular Sulayman, who was the prince closest to Constantinople and who would have been the most familiar to her, and whose descendants ruled the Sultanate of Rum at the time that she was writing in the 1040s. This is compounded by her misunderstanding of the nature of Turkish and Seljuk politics, the multipolar nature of the Seljuk state, and of Turkish states in general that we have covered over and over again on this podcast. Instead, she sees the Turks as monolithic and centrally directed by the well-known prince with royal blood, namely Sulayman. Furthermore, she sort of projects back in time the Sultanate of Rum as it existed when she was writing, when it was a centralized state recognized as the leading Turkish state in Anatolia. But that was not what the state was during Sulayman's day. Indeed, it was hardly a state at all. Consequently, her biases sort of end up aligning with the biases of the Muslim historians. Sulayman is presented as essentially the lord of all of Anatolia, and as the leader of a highly developed state from the early 1080s onwards. But this is really not what actually happened. As we will see, Sulayman started off as one of many Turkish beys, and he basically fought and negotiated his way to the top. But even then, he never really became the lord of all of Anatolia, or even really the lord of all of the Turkish beyliks. He basically ended up becoming the first among equals, and he did this with great cunning and audacity, using his great lineage and his connection to Roman imperial power to carve out a sultanate from this new frontier zone in Anatolia. But we should not think of this as preordained, and we should not imagine him sitting in İznik as the lord of Western Anatolia or even the real overlord of the other Turkish beys. He was in essence a bey among beys, even if he claimed the title Sultan due to his comparatively exalted lineage and his grand aspirations. But his sultanate was, here in 1081, still that: aspirational. Though he claimed the title Sultan, he was in reality merely the Bey of İznik, holding a small pocket of territory around the city of İznik and the northern and southern coasts of the Bay of İzmit. That is, on the doorstep of the Roman capital of Constantinople. And it would take all of his great skill and audacity to turn this nascent state into something more than a beylik. So how did Sulayman do this? Well, to start with, while in 1081 he was just a bey among beys, he was a bey with a couple major advantages that the others did not have. Firstly, there was his lineage. If you'll recall, the other beys of Anatolia mostly came from nowhere. Their beyliks were at this very moment emerging, very much nascent political entities, and they themselves were a fairly motley crew. Most beys were descended from random Turkish chieftains, and most likely not the most powerful aristocrats. The true elite, of course, were with the court of the great Seljuk Sultan. But Sulayman was different. He had a truly elite lineage. Not just a high-ranking aristocrat, but a prince of the House of Seljuk himself. In the Middle Ages, this lineage was a powerful tool, something he could use to force the other beys to submit and recognize his sovereignty. Think of the letter from Şöklü Bey to Sulayman when he requested aid to overthrow Atsız. He wrote, "You are a sultan who is a member of the House of Seljuk, and we would be proud and honored to obey you and find ourselves in your service, for the Emir Atsız is not of the House of Seljuk, and for this reason we cannot obey him." And to be clear, even if loyalty to the House of Seljuk wasn't actually Şöklü Bey's primary motivation, the very fact that he framed his request in these terms shows the power of the Seljuk name among the tribes and the beys. In short, both the tribes and the Roman Empire saw the rule of the House of Seljuk as legitimate. This gave Sulayman an immediate and powerful advantage over the other beys. And perhaps even more important was Sulayman's relation with the Roman state. Most of all, Sulayman's recognition by the Roman Empire of course gave him access to large and steady tribute payments, no doubt extremely helpful in building a sultanate. But recognition also had other, less material benefits. It increased his stature, both among the other beys and among the Byzantine elites that he needed. Remember, the Sultanate of Rum and the other beyliks were in essence fusion states. They will meld together a Persian high court culture taken from the Great Seljuk Empire, the religion of Islam, Turkish military and political organization, and the pre-existing structures of the Roman Empire. This was deeply connected to the nature of the emergence of the Sultanate and the beyliks. They in essence formed through alliances between Turkish military men and existing Roman elites. The Turks, stepping in to fill the void left by the now vanished Roman military apparatus. And as Sulayman therefore relied on the Byzantine elites within the territories of his sultanate, recognition by the emperor was no doubt of value in building and expanding his state. So with these high cards in his pocket, Sulayman then set out to really expand his power, to be more than just the Bey of İznik, but to earn his title of Sultan, to achieve what his father Kutalmish and his grandfather Arslan Israel had failed to do. It seems likely that Sulayman's first real advances were to the south and the east. With the court in Constantinople paying him tribute, and with a peace treaty in place, Sulayman was safe to concentrate on his other frontiers. Indeed, the first of these advances likely happened even before his treaty with Alexios. As we discussed in our last episode, in 1080, Nikephoros Melissenos had revolted in Western Anatolia and made his base in Eskişehir, then called Dorylaeum. He had relied heavily on the Turks and had turned over much of the military rule in Western Anatolia to them. Sulayman had of course benefited from this, as had the other Turkish beys in the region. But then, when Melissenos left Eskişehir in 1081, it seems that Sulayman moved in right after him. Ana Komnena makes several references to the Sultan in Eskişehir in 1081, meaning that Sulayman probably entered into the city around this time. Eskişehir was one of the most important cities in Western Anatolia, and its submission to Sulayman was of great importance. With both Eskişehir and İznik in his hands, Sulayman's nascent sultanate was the most important political entity in northwestern Anatolia. Then, Sulayman appears to have moved quickly against both the local Turkish beys in the region and the few remaining Roman military outposts still somehow clinging on to the plateau. Indeed, as a practical matter, there was probably not a great deal of difference between a Roman commander holding onto an isolated fortress or city, likely relying on Turkish mercenaries anyway, and a Turkish bey doing the exact same thing. Sulayman most likely did this through a combination of warfare and diplomacy, though we don't really have reliable details. I imagine him both defeating smaller beys or Roman garrisons in skirmishes, and then threatening the others to toe the line and recognize his suzerainty. And at the same time, as he was bullying his rivals into submission, he certainly made alliances with other potentates. Most important of these was his alliance with a strange sort of Turkish bey named Chaka Bey. Chaka Bey was basically a former Roman general who had set up his own beylik in Izmir on the Aegean coast beginning in the late 1070s and early 1080s. In a sign of the messy nature of Anatolia at this time, and the extent to which Turkish beyliks really were joint Turco-Roman projects, Chaka had actually started out as basically a mercenary serving Byzantium. He was a Turkish raider who had been taken captive on a raid at some point during the reign of Emperor Votanyates. He was then enslaved and pressed into service. Chaka fought for Byzantium, rapidly rising through the ranks, ultimately even being granted imperial titles of nobility. Then, when Alexios overthrew Votaniatis, Chaka refused to accept the new emperor. He rebelled and established a beylik centered around Izmir. Quite honestly, not all that different from a traditional Roman general's rebellion. Again, a sign of how much Turkish rule was part and parcel of the Roman imperial tradition. Drawing on largely Turkish and Pecheneg mercenaries that had previously served the empire, and likely augmented by newcomers streaming into Anatolia, Chaka Bey's young beylik soon controlled most of the Aegean coastline of Anatolia. Ana Komnena explicitly calls Chaka Bey an ally of Sulayman, clearly indicating that they were equals, not that Chaka Bey was a vassal. And Chaka Bey and Sulayman appear to have divided much of Western Anatolia between themselves over the course of 1082 and 1083. Chaka Bey taking the coastline and the islands, and Sulayman the interior, the land of the plateau itself. The local Turkish beys and remaining Roman garrisons were forced to submit to one or the other. At the same time, Sulayman was also working to expand his power and authority to the south and the east. An anonymous and highly idealized 14th century Seljuk source writes that, first he, Sulayman, took Konya from Marta and Kusta, and the fortress of Kavala from Romanos Makri. That is, it lists both Turkish and Byzantine enemies that Sulayman overcame. Konya is of course one of the greatest cities of Anatolia, situated in the south and center of the plateau, near the mountains bordering the Mediterranean. And Kavala is a great fortress near Konya. Now, while this source is of course problematic, it does seem that Konya had been taken over by Turkish beys after the departure of Roussel de Bayeux from the region. And it does seem that it was sometime after 1081 that it came under Sulayman's sovereignty. The date traditionally given for its capture by Sulayman is 1084. Unfortunately, we don't have the specifics. No source provides any mention of a battle or a surrender of the city. This might be because no account was written, or it might be that no battle took place. That Sulayman simply forced the beys of Konya and the Roman general in the nearby fortress to submit to him. However, as it happened, the acquisition of Konya was of critical importance to Sulayman's nascent sultanate. Because in time, Konya will, of course, become the second capital of the Sultanate of Rum. The other great acquisition of Sulayman in central Anatolia was Aksaray. Aksaray is situated near one of the salt lakes that dot the plateau, this one called simply Tuz Gölü, or Salt Lake in Turkish. It is situated midway between the two great cities of Kayseri and Konya, and in the Byzantine era, it was also near major ecclesiastic centers, and it was home to a critical fortress of the region. Though its importance has diminished in the intervening centuries, it was at the time a key strategic point. And though we do not have details of its submission, we do know that Sulayman secured the rule of it. For example, Ibn al-Athir calls Sulayman the Lord of Konya and Aksaray and their regions in Anatolia. And given what's about to happen, it seems clear that Sulayman must have thereafter secured the submission of the rest of the lands of the plateau to the south of Konya and Aksaray. The edges of the plateau before the mountains drop off into the Mediterranean and Cilicia. So by 1084, Sulayman was one of the key potentates in all of Anatolia. This expansion across western and central Anatolia over the course of less than 4 years was truly something. The distance between Sulayman's home base in northwestern Anatolia, the area around İznik and Eskişehir, and Konya and Aksaray, is quite vast, over 400 kilometers. Crucially, these two regions lie on opposite sides of a large basin of semi-arid grasslands that dominates the western part of the Anatolian plateau, giving the tribes following Sulayman ample access to the pasturages. In a period of just a couple years, Sulayman had dramatically expanded the reach of his sovereignty. He was well on his way to making his audacious claim to be a sultan a reality. Indeed, I imagine that Sulayman's usage of the title Sultan in 1081, when he made his treaty with Emperor Alexios, must have elicited laughter among those who heard about it in the great courts of the Seljuk Empire. Who was this border lord, a mere bey, on the fringes of the empire, to use such a title? Yeah, he's got his noble lineage, his blue blood, but he's basically the mayor of İznik in reality. But now, even if they were still smirking, it was with a bit of anxiety and a little apprehension. Sulayman was now, in a shockingly short amount of time, a serious player in Seljuk politics. But we should not forget that although Sulayman was now a serious player, he was far from the overlord of all of Anatolia that Anakomnena and the later Seljuk historians make him out to be. There were the other great potentates. To his west, there was his ally, the rebel Turkish Roman general Chaka Bey and his young Aegean beylik. And to his east, there were the other beyliks we discussed last time, the Mengujakids, the Saltukids, the Artukids, and most important of all, the Danishmends. See, though the evidence and chronology is a bit spotty, it seems that at the same time Sulayman was pushing south and east from İznik, the Danishmends were pushing west and south from Sivas. By the early 1080s, the other great cities of Kayseri and Ankara appear to have fallen under Danishmend suzerainty, though Kayseri had been pretty thoroughly devastated by Turkish raiding and warfare and was now a shadow of what it had been a mere 50 years earlier. So we should think of Western and Central Anatolia at this time as being divided into basically three north-south strips. On the Aegean coast and the islands, Chaka Bey and his beylik mostly made up of rebel Byzantine mercenaries. In the west and center of the plateau, Sulayman's nascent sultanate, led from İznik. And in the east and center of the plateau, the Danishmend beylik. This rapid expansion, coupled with Sulayman's illustrious ancestry and his relationship with the Roman state, greatly increased his standing within the multipolar Seljuk Empire. If you'll recall from our non-narrative episode on the nature of the state in the Great Seljuk Empire, the empire was not a highly centralized or rigidly hierarchical political entity. There were a variety of courts and power centers, all vying with each other for prestige, power, and influence. The state was, in essence, a project of constant negotiation among these power centers. The Great Seljuk Court, the lower courts like the Kirman Shahs descended from Kavort or the House of Afrasiab or Tutush in Syria, the beys, the tribes, the caliphs, the bureaucracy itself, al-Dawla al-Nizamiya, and so on. And now, with the consolidation of his nascent sultanate in Western Anatolia, Sulayman was knocking on the door of the top tier of Seljuk politics, the Premier League, the elite level of negotiation and struggle for power. And so Sulayman would begin to play that game, to increase his power and standing within the Seljuk Empire with a kind of crazy dream in his mind. To one day take back the full birthright of the line of Kutalmish, the very throne of the great Seljuk Empire, unjustly snatched from his grandfather and his father. A truly audacious goal. And it would be playing this game of Seljuk politics, attempting to achieve this fantastical dream, that would ultimately end in catastrophe for Sulayman, which to me is a little bit funny. He is presented in the traditional Seljuk and Turkish histories as a great Ghazi warrior, the man conquering Anatolia from the infidel, even as a servant of the great Seljuk Sultan, carrying out a great invasion on his orders and as ordained by Allah, instead of, a man burning with ambition to overthrow the Sultan. But in reality, it would turn out that Sulayman was far more adept and successful at playing Byzantine politics than Seljuk politics. And his end will not come in a glorious jihad against the infidel, but through his reckless attempt to reach the pinnacle of power in the great Seljuk Empire. So as Sulayman approached this top tier of Seljuk politics, he of course needed to find advantages against his rivals for power, the other beys, Nizam-ul-Mulk and the powerful bureaucracy of al-Dawla al-Nizamiya, Tutush, the Lord of Syria, and perhaps above all, his cousin, the great Seljuk Sultan Melik Shah. And being a border lord, he of course quickly identified his main advantages: his status as a Ghazi and his relationship with the wild tribes. Indeed, the historian A.C.S. Peacock has argued that we need to see Sulayman's goal as to essentially become the key leader of the wild Turkmen tribes, who never really liked or trusted the thoroughly Persianized court, or the cooked great Seljuk Sultan Melik Shah. That is, his goal was to supplant Melik Shah as the leader of the Turkmen, and thus, ultimately, seek to topple him. Like I said, a truly audacious goal. And these would be the tools Sulayman would use to try to achieve it. His ability to summon the wild tribes gave him military power. His status as a Ghazi prosecuting the jihad gave him legitimacy. And these were in fact related. It was by prosecuting the jihad, aka raiding the infidel, that the tribes received the plunder and loot that they fought for, and that bound them to their Khan in the tradition of the steppe going back centuries. Basically, an Islamic gloss on the traditional steppe world's relations of power. And it was the ability to summon the tribes that of course gave Sulayman the ability to be a Ghazi and prosecute the jihad. That's where the troops came from. But there was sort of a problem here, a fly in the ointment. Sulayman hadn't actually really fought against the infidel in a while. Yeah, he had started out by raiding Cappadocia like a decade earlier. But then he came to İznik, where most of his fighting of the infidel was actually in the service of other infidels. Indeed, he had been a vassal of the Roman emperor until like 3 or 4 years ago. He had come to power through his canny negotiations with the court in Constantinople, and in essence, co-opting the local Byzantine nobility in the lands he ruled. And a lot of his fighting had actually been against other Turkish beys, the ones who had refused to offer recognition. So Sulayman really needed to do something to burnish his Ghazi status. But he also didn't really want to attack the Byzantine Empire directly. First of all, taking Constantinople was, of course, clearly impossible. A total pipe dream that even a dreamer like Sulayman could not contemplate. And while he could raid the Asian suburbs and the coastlines under Byzantine rule, that would just serve to disrupt his incredibly profitable relationship with Emperor Alexios, one that involved both massive tribute payments and the emperor's recognition, both of which he saw as incredibly important. And furthermore, Constantinople was sort of in the wrong direction. Sulayman wanted to increase his power and authority among the Turkmen of Anatolia and within the heartland of the Great Seljuk Empire, to become the supreme leader of the tribes in the empire itself. He was focused inwards on Seljuk politics, in other words, back to the east, not outwards to the west towards the great city. So raiding what remained of the Byzantine territories in northwestern Anatolia was a non-starter. But there was a place where Sulayman could go. A place that would make him both very popular with the tribes within the Great Seljuk Empire and place him right on the doorstep of Syria. a place that was also very helpfully ruled by infidels. And infidels not on the best of terms with Constantinople. Antioch. Antioch, Antakya in Turkish, lies in the very south of modern-day Turkey in the province of Hatay. It sits just to the west of Syria, in a mountain valley in the mountains of Latakia, just inland from the Mediterranean Sea. And it is an absolutely ancient city. It was founded by one of Alexander the Great's generals, Seleucus I, and served as the capital of his successor state to Alexander's empire. It grew in importance, becoming one of the most important cities of the Roman Empire, serving often as an eastern capital. It had fallen to the armies of Islam during the reign of Umar and became one of the most important cities of the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates. But then, after the anarchy at Samarra broke the Abbasid Caliphate, the Byzantines were able to reconquer the city in 969. It had remained in Byzantine hands all the way through the rise of the Fatimid Caliphate and the Great Seljuk Empire, where it served as the key bulwark of the empire in Syria. But then came Manzikert and the total collapse of Byzantine authority in Anatolia, and Antioch became isolated. It was now an outpost of Byzantium, connected to Constantinople only by sea. And the commander of Antioch, a man named Philaritos Vrachamios, was now in essence a practically independent ruler. Vrachamios, like many Byzantine generals, was of Armenian ancestry. He rose through the ranks of the imperial army and had actually been at Manzikert himself, fighting alongside Emperor Romanos Theogenes. He had managed to escape the disaster and fled with some troops to the southwest, setting himself up for a time in Elazığ. In a sign of how dependent the Roman Empire had become on mercenaries, most of his troops were in fact Latin knights from the west. As the Turks pressed in on Elazığ, Vrachamios retreated again, ultimately coming to Cilicia and Antioch. Here, in the last defensible corner of the Eastern Roman Empire, he declared himself emperor. However, as the politics in Byzantium turned, Vrachamios ultimately negotiated a deal with the late Emperor Votaniates to give up his claim to the purple in 1078. He was instead appointed Duke of Antioch and promised free reign. Vrachamios was still the duke when Alexios came to power, and he seems to have recognized Alexios, but this was merely lip service. In reality, he was the king of Cilicia and Antioch in all but name, ruling as the Duke of Antioch. This Ducate of Antioch was not, in any practical sense, a part of the Byzantine Empire any longer. The Ducate of Antioch was therefore the perfect target for Sulayman. Victory there would cement his power as a Ghazi warrior, a prosecutor of the jihad, and it would put him on the doorstep of the lands ruled by al-Dawla al-Nizamiya. Critically, the Cilician Gates, one of the only really good passes from the plateau to the south and into Syria, would also come under his control. From here, with the wild tribes at his command, Sulayman could move further east and perhaps, one day, finally take the great prize denied to his family for so long, the throne of the great Seljuk Empire itself. And because Vrachamios was in essence an independent ruler and one who had supported the deposed Emperor Votaniates, no doubt Sulayman calculated that a move against him would not overly anger Emperor Alexios, and thus wreck his absolutely critical relationship with Constantinople. And Antioch had yet another advantage as a target. The Ducate was riven by internal political disorder, a dispute between Vrachamios and some of the elites of Antioch, who coalesced around the prefect of Antioch and the eldest son of Vrachamios. According to both Byzantine and Muslim sources, Vrachamios' son then sought an alliance with Sulayman. This was perfect for Sulayman. It meant that he would have local collaborators, local elites to partner with. And as we have seen, cooperation with local Christian elites was critical to the Sultanate of Rum. With dreams of overthrowing Melik Shah filling his head, Sulayman therefore began to prepare for a war on Cilicia and Antioch, to take from Duke Vrachamios the last of the Roman domains in the east. He began by sending probing missions and raids into Cilicia in 1082 and 1084, scouting out weaknesses in the defenses guarding the passes and preparing for a full invasion. Finally, in 1084, Sulayman assembled an army of wild Turkmen in Western Anatolia, a small force, likely numbering no more than a couple thousand men. Indeed, Ibn al-Athir says it was a mere 300 cavalrymen, likely an exaggeration for effect. Sulayman informed them that they were going to march south and east, back across Anatolia, and descend down into Cilicia. There they would capture Antioch, the last great Asian possession of the Roman Empire, still ruled by the infidel. The men must have been astounded that Sulayman intended to do this with such a small force, but they agreed to go nonetheless. Fatefully, Sulayman did not leave İznik in the hands of his sons, an indication, perhaps, that he hoped to move his capital to Antioch after the fall. Indeed, according to Ana Komnena, he brought both of his sons, the future Sultan Kılıç Arslan and the younger son Daoud, with him as he rode east. Instead, he entrusted the care of İznik and his lands in Anatolia to a man Komnena calls Abul Qasim, probably her rendering of Ebul Qasim in Turkish. Ebul Qasim was a Turk, and he seems to have served in a role approximating that of a Grand Vizier or second-in-command. Ana Komnena says that Sulayman departed İznik and rode for 12 nights, appearing suddenly and unexpectedly before the walls of Antioch. Interestingly, Ibn al-Athir says that Sulayman's army arrived both by sea and land, and, quote, contained a large number of infantry. This would strongly imply that Sulayman was using native Anatolian troops. The steppe riders, of course, would be cavalry troops and would travel by sea only extremely rarely, and then only with other people doing the sailing. So if this anecdote is true, it would mean that Sulayman was already incorporating native Anatolian Greeks into his army. Whatever the composition of his army, Sulayman appeared suddenly before the walls of Antioch in December 1084. Vrachamios was clearly taken by surprise. Ana Komnena writes that the city fell in the first assault. Ibn al-Athir provides us with a bit more detail and says, he erected ladders by agreement with the prefect and his men, and scaled the wall to join with the prefect and take the town. The local inhabitants resisted him, and he defeated them time after time, killing many of them. He pardoned them and took over the citadel, known as Al-Qusayn. The treasure he took was beyond counting, and he showed kindness to the people and was just. Thus Antioch fell to the Sultan of Rum. The news that the great city was back in Muslim hands after a century of Christian rule quickly spread throughout the Muslim world, enhancing Sulayman's reputation immeasurably. The prestige of being the man who had reconquered Antioch was invaluable. He now really was a Ghazi holy warrior, a leader of the jihad. Though I would note that even this great victory was in fact predicated on cooperation with his Christian allies in Antioch, and perhaps even involved Christian troops, if Ibn al-Athir is to be believed. Even now, after retaking Antioch for Islam, Sulayman being called a Ghazi is still a bit much. Yet regardless of the nature of its fall, the news that Antioch had fallen caused a sensation in the Muslim world. Indeed, this incident is really the first major incident involving Sulayman that appears in the Islamic histories. This was his coming out party in many ways. Bursting onto the scene of history, and really entering the truly top rank of Seljuk politics. He was now in the Premier League. No one was laughing now. He was no longer a mere border lord. He truly was a sultan. In Baghdad, the famous Arab poet al-Abiwardi even composed a poem in honor of Sulayman, saying, "There flashed like the forelock of a pale stallion, a fire where the dusty sand dunes gather. You have conquered Byzantine Antioch, which enmeshed Alexander in its toils. Your steeds have trampled her flanks and humbled the daughters of the pale face miscarry their unborn children." And of course, in Esfahan, the great Seljuk Sultan Melik Shah was looking at all of this with a great deal of trepidation. Seemingly out of nowhere, his cousin, long banished to the fringes of the empire, had crashed into the top tier of the Seljuk political world. He had been recognized by the Emperor of the Romans. He had conquered a wide swath of Anatolia, including retaking the great city of Antioch from the Christians. He was using the title Sultan, and perhaps most troubling of all, he was becoming quite popular with the wild Turkmen tribes. Those same tribes that Melik Shah and the cunning Nizam-ul-Mulk had always had a difficult relationship with. And this victory in Antioch would no doubt draw more tribes to the banner of this upstart so-called Sultan of Rum. Melik Shah, of course, had to congratulate Sulayman on conquering Antioch for the true faith, but he did this through gritted teeth. He was not happy at all that Sulayman had accomplished this great victory and was now sitting on his very doorstep. Melik Shah wrote to Sulayman congratulating him, but also reminding him that he was a servant of the great Seljuk Sultan. He politely reminded Sulayman that the name Melik Shah was to be read in the khutbah. Melik Shah then went further and solicited congratulations from across the Muslim world for this great conquest achieved under his reign. And of course, he began pondering what his next steps might have to be. Out of nowhere, the line of Kutalmish was clearly making a comeback. I'm sure that on some level, Sulayman was absolutely furious that Melik Shah was, in essence, taking credit for his great victory in Antioch. But he also must have recognized the scale of this victory. Even having the great Seljuk Sultan take credit for something he did was, in a sense, a great compliment. And now, he was in a position to go even further. Antioch had just been the starting point. No doubt, Sulayman hoped to remain here and not return to Anatolia, to conquer further, and hopefully take the throne of the great empire himself. Conflict, predictably, soon erupted between Sulayman and another not entirely loyal vassal of the great Seljuk Sultan, the emir of nearby Aleppo, Sharaf al-Dawla. Now we, of course, last saw Aleppo being ruled by Emir Mahmud, who submitted to Alparslan shortly before Manzikert. After that, Aleppo became a vassal of the great Seljuk Empire. But then, as we saw, Tutush set out to destroy the Nawakiya Beylik, marching out of Iran to the Levant. Along the way, he had besieged Aleppo, though he had been forced to break it off. In a long and twisting turn of events I'm not really going to get into, Tutush ultimately ended up getting rid of Emir Mahmud by forcing him to cede Aleppo to Sharaf al-Dawla, a man Tutush hoped to be more pliable. But Sharaf al-Dawla had also turned out to not be a perfect vassal, and he had ended up fighting a brief war against the Seljuk court before being defeated, pardoned, and sent back to Aleppo chastened. And now, Sharaf al-Dawla and Sulayman were falling into squabbling. See, before being conquered by Sulayman, the Ducate of Antioch had paid tribute to Sharaf al-Dawla, and Sharaf al-Dawla now demanded that Sulayman continue the practice. Sharaf al-Dawla was almost certainly encouraged to do this by the Seljuk court, looking for ways to clip Sulayman's wings, because the Islamic histories say that Sharaf al-Dawla couched this demand in terms of demanding loyalty to the great Sultan's orders. Affronted, Sulayman of course refused. How was a sultan to pay tribute to a mere emir, especially a Ghazi sultan who had gained this territory through wielding the sword of jihad? He reportedly responded in part, "Obedience to the sultan is my watchword and my cloak. His name is in the khutbah and on the coinage in my lands. I have already written to announce which lands and infidel territory God has conquered at my hand and through his felicity. As for the tribute that the Lord of Antioch paid previously, well, he was an infidel, and paid his and his men's jizya. I, praise be to God, am a believer, and I shall deliver nothing." And on Sulayman's part, the Sultan of Rum was busy cultivating the tribes of Syria and southern Anatolia as part of his larger political project, tribes that routinely raided the lands of the Emirate of Aleppo. This, of course, was deeply threatening to both Sharaf al-Dawla and the Seljuk court. In Esfahan, Melik Shah and Nizam-ul-Mulk were becoming increasingly anxious about the rapid rise of Sulayman and his growing following among the tribes still in the central lands of the empire. Thus, the two Seljuk potentates came to blows. Sharaf al-Dawla began sending raiding parties into Antioch as the tribes escalated their raiding and plundering of the lands of Aleppo. Sulayman even led raids of Aleppo himself, both an affront to Sharaf al-Dawla and a way to increase his standing among the tribes. Likely with the encouragement of the court in Esfahan, Sharaf al-Dawla therefore decided to march against Sulayman. In the spring of 1085, he assembled an army in Aleppo composed of both Arab warriors and Turkmen warriors led by a leader named Jabak. This army then marched on Antioch itself and laid the great city to siege. Upon hearing the news, Sulayman, who was likely somewhere in Cilicia, gathered up an army of Turks and began racing towards Antioch. The two armies met on June 20th, 1085, at a place called Kurzahil, on the banks of the river Afrin. And unfortunately for Sharaf al-Dawla, Sulayman's popularity with the tribes seems to have decided the matter. Ibn al-Athir relates, "Battle was joined, and Jabak's Turkomans sided with Sulayman. The Arabs fled, and Sharaf al-Dawla followed them, defeated. He was slain after making some stubborn resistance, and 400 young men of the Aleppo militia were killed defending him." With his troops now strengthened by further Turkmen troops, Sulayman then marched into Syria and put Aleppo to siege a mere 7 days later, on June 27th, 1085. He left his sons Kılıç Arslan and Daoud back in Antioch. Sulayman sent a message to the local headman of the city demanding that he turn Aleppo over. And Sulayman sent this message in the most dramatic way possible. Attached to the corpse of Sharaf al-Dawla, which he tied to the back of a mule that was then sent to walk towards the gates of Aleppo. Upon seeing this morbid spectacle, the headman of Aleppo pleaded that he needed to get in touch with Melik Shah. Melik Shah, Nizam-ul-Mulk, and Tutush were now becoming increasingly alarmed. Not only had this Sultan of Rum defeated and killed Sharaf al-Dawla, and then even marched to Aleppo itself, he had done it in the most terrifying way possible from their perspective. By rallying the tribes and getting the Turkmen to side with him against their former master. This was always the great fear of the court, that a powerful Seljuk prince would get the tribes to turn on them. But it would turn out that this would be the high water mark of Sulayman's career, because this audacious power play, sending a dead emir's body on a mule back to his city, was in fact incredibly reckless. Sulayman had conquered Antioch with a relatively small force. Based on circumstantial evidence in the histories of Ana Komnena, Ibn al-Athir, and Sibt ibn al-Jawzi, we can say that it was probably just a couple thousand Turkmen warriors and potentially some Greek infantry. And while he had since augmented his forces with local Turkmen rallying to his banner and some local Arab warriors, the forces at his command were still not that substantial. He was not leading hundreds or even tens of thousands of men. And he now had antagonized the Seljuk court itself, which could call on vast, vast numbers of troops. Furthermore, Sulayman appears to have totally miscalculated in his attempt to seize Aleppo. There was no appetite among the elites of the city for him as a ruler. Unlike in Antioch, or the cities of Anatolia, where he had local Christian elites he could rely on, Sulayman was on his own here. Unlike the Christian elites he had dealt with in the past, the Shia elites of Aleppo were not eager to cooperate with this upstart sultan. And Sulayman had antagonized not just the local elites of Aleppo, but the Seljuk court itself in his attempts to conquer the city. Thus, Tutush decided to act. He sent word to Artuk, now in the Jazirat, and persuaded him to ride west as Tutush himself marched north out of Damascus. Their armies linked up and began marching on Aleppo. And of course, their army was many times the size of Sulayman's. Upon hearing of the advance of Tutush and Artuk, Sulayman jumped into action. He knew that he was outnumbered and that he'd need the element of surprise to win this engagement. So he gathered up his forces and raced to confront the advancing army with all speed, hoping to catch them unawares. In a rather clever piece of generalship, Sulayman appears to have gotten the drop on Tutush and Artuk. He managed to get his army into position undetected and launched a surprise attack on Tutush and Artuk near the village of Ain Salam, near Aleppo, before the two great generals expected him to arrive. Ibn al-Athir relates, he, Sulayman, made contact with Tutush at dawn before he had drawn up his battle formation. Tutush knew nothing of him until he had come close, and then he drew up his men for battle. And I'd just note how brave, how audacious, and indeed how reckless this was. Outnumbered, Sulayman decided to attack first. Not negotiate, not retreat back to Antioch, not slink back to Anatolia, but attack. This sort of audacity, this sort of recklessness defined him. It was what gave him the self-confidence when he was a mere border lord on the fringes of the empire to declare himself a sultan. It was how he had fought and negotiated with Roman emperors and Turkish beys to become a sultan and lay the foundations of his sultanate. It was how he had invaded Antioch with nothing but a small army of Turkmen and maybe some Greek infantry. It was how he had defeated the emir of Aleppo and sent his corpse back to the city on a mule. It was what made his stunning rise possible, and it was now what would destroy him. Because so outnumbered was Sulayman that even this surprise attack, which he pulled off pretty well, did not work. Tutush and Artuk rallied their forces and broke back Sulayman's charge. They overwhelmed the forces of the Sultan of Rum. Ibn al-Athir reports, Sulayman's men fled, but Sulayman himself stood in the center. Seeing that his troops were defeated, he drew a dagger he wore and killed himself. This is confirmed by Ana Komnena, who writes, he drew his sword from its sheath and plunged it deep into his bowels, and thus the wretched man died wretchedly. Meanwhile, Sibt ibn al-Jawzi reports that Sulayman was instead killed by an arrow shot to his face as he rode towards his enemies. And I'll leave it to you to decide what is a more fitting end for the first Roman Sultan. standing defiantly as his men break around him and choosing suicide over capture, or shot off his horse in a great and doomed last charge. Following the death of Sulayman, Tutush took control of his men. Reportedly, he easily identified Sulayman's corpse upon seeing its feet, saying, "His foot resembles my foot, for the feet of the sons of Seljuk resemble each other." Then Tutush repeated the same stunt that Sulayman himself had performed with the dead Sharaf al-Dawla. With karmic justice, the corpse of Sulayman, the first Sultan of Rum, was tied to the back of a mule and sent to the gates of Aleppo. Following this, Tutush performed the traditional rituals required in Turkish culture upon the death of a member of the ruling house, including shedding tears and praying in the Turkish language. Then Tutush laid Sulayman to rest in the tombs of the emirs of Aleppo, next to the grave of Sharaf al-Dawla. Thus passed Sulayman ibn Kutalmish, the founder of the Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, the first Roman Sultan. As I said, his was a life defined by audacity and recklessness, which both allowed him to lay the foundations for the Sultanate of Rum, but also led to his own destruction. Sulayman is of course remembered in absolutely grandiose terms in Turkey today. The greatest and most honorable father of the Turks of Anatolia, Anadolu Türklerin en büyük ve en muhterem babası. The later Islamic histories always portray him as a great Ghazi holy warrior, conquering the Byzantine infidel with the sword of jihad. But I would note that he actually came to power more through negotiation with the Byzantine elites than through the sword of jihad. Indeed, he was far more adept at playing Byzantine politics than Seljuk politics. And his greatest enemy turned out to not be the Roman Empire or the Christians of Anatolia, but rather his cousin Melik Shah in the court of the great Seljuk Empire. Indeed, the most important piece of Sulayman's legacy is probably not his conquests, but rather his laying the foundations of a state that would come to endure his end and maintain its independence from the great Seljuk Empire. When his contemporary Atsız had been defeated by Tutush, the court had gobbled up the Nawakiya Beylik. But in Anatolia, the Sultanate of Rum would come to survive the death of its founder. Though its future must have seemed very unclear at the moment, Sulayman had laid its foundations well. So well that in time, his son would be able to pick up where he left off and really build a great state. And while Turkish historians can be a bit effusive in their praise of its founder, that is still quite a legacy to leave. Following the death of Sulayman, Melik Shah marched into northern Syria. Aleppo and the other cities of the region chose to submit to him instead of Tutush. Artuk attempted to convince Tutush to confront his brother, but Tutush demurred and returned to Damascus. Finally, Melik Shah came to Antioch, and the ancient city submitted to the great Seljuk Sultan. Melik Shah was now the lord of northern Syria, as al-Dawla al-Nizamiya entered its twilight. And as he marched back home to Esfahan, Melik Shah brought with him 2 captives. The sons of Sulayman, the younger Daoud, and the elder bearing the name Kılıç Arslan, the Sword Lion. Sulayman's young sultanate likely seemed finished. Its founder was dead, and his sons, the men who could claim to be the next Roman Sultan, were now in the hands of the great Seljuk Sultan. But it turns out that reports of the death of the Sultanate of Rum would be premature. And next time, Kılıç Arslan will ride west to claim his birthright, as al-Dawla al-Nizamiya comes crashing down.